a year ago, a paper was published in Nature, which is the top science journal around. I'm one of 44 co-authors. And the authors are people that either excavated human remains in East Africa in this time range or more recent, or the people that did DNA studies. And it was in a news story on the internet that I discovered that our individual is the oldest sub-Saharan African from which a DNA sample has been obtained so far.
Really?
And no one told me that. I had no idea. It's in the fine print in the appendix to this formal article.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with another episode with an archaeologist. This is going to be so much fun because we're going to talk about the Stone Age and various other kinds of places in the world that may have cool artifacts. We have Pamela R Willoughby. How are you doing today?
Fine.
You are professor of anthropology, PhD, at the University of Alberta. It's fair to say you probably know your stuff.
I hope so.
We'll see.
But I keep learning.
Oh, that's the right attitude. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess let's start at the beginning. How did you get interested in the past and artifacts?
I always was interested in the past. I went as an undergraduate to a small university in Ontario, Canada, to major in history. But I also took a first-year anthropology course to be able to take more advanced archaeology courses. Because in North America, archaeology, except for classical archaeology like Greece and Rome, is taught in anthropology departments. And eventually I realized that the kind of history I liked besides ancient history was cultural contact and colonialism and Europeans writing about all these weird other people they were encountering. And I said, you can do that in anthropology as well. But my first experience doing old world Stone Age archaeology didn't happen until I was an MA student.
And did you go to Alberta the whole time?
No, I was an undergrad it was almost an experimental university in Ontario called Trent. And it was designed to be like a British university with dons and tutors and residences and tutorials and seminars. And it was a pretty unique kind of place. But my MA is from the University of Alberta. And I still tell people that coming here the first time was probably the biggest culture shock I ever had, because I'd never been further west than about Toronto, which is thousands of kilometers away from Edmonton. But I had a chance, as an MA student, I worked on what happened at the end of the Ice Age in Europe and North Africa in terms of changes in diet and behavior. And I accompanied my MA supervisor to Eastern Algeria for 10 weeks of fieldwork one summer. The year before, he sent me to volunteer on a project in southern France, which belongs to what's called the Upper Paleolithic, which was the first Homo sapiens in Europe. And southern France is the center of the universe for this kind of study because of the sites and the cave paintings and the phenomenal history of work there. Plus, it was a great place to spend a summer because we had wine with lunch and dinner every day, fresh food off the farm. So,
oh, that sounds just right.
I taught at a university for 2 years after that, and then I went to UCLA to do a PhD. So I went to Southern California.
Oh wow! So what was that?
I worked with people at UCLA as well as at Berkeley. Okay. And the Berkeley people were the ones that were doing the earliest archaeology in East Africa.
Wow. And
the person there gave me a project. It was beginning to be more like natural science or sciences, where the supervisor has a project and he recruits students to do bits and pieces of it. So he was willing to work with me, and he gave me a dissertation topic, which involved traveling initially to Paris to look at North African archaeological collections, then to Israel, and then all the way through East and Southern Africa. And I had a chance to travel to see sites. I stayed with local people wherever possible. And I basically decided that this is the kind of thing I wanted to do. And I was working on the oldest archaeology. And it's ironic that what I've done since is actually the time period in between that, the oldest stuff, and the kind of things I was working at in Algeria. It's a time period between about 200,000 and about 10 or 12,000 years ago. That's my focus now.
And what led you to move from here to there as far as time periods?
It was in terms of opportunities. The person I worked with at Berkeley was the top researcher in the world in the archaeology of human origins. So I was thrilled with the chance to work with him, even peripherally. And I was going to be part of his next big field project. He had one in northern Kenya for maybe about 15 years. And he was moving to northern Tanzania, and I was going to be part of that. And then he suddenly passed away 4 months after I finished my PhD. And he was only 47 years old.
Oh, geez.
So it was a real surprise. But when I was in Tanzania, one of the people I met was one of the senior officers in their, it's called, the acronym is COSTEC. It's called their Committee on Science and Technology. And at that point, the border between Kenya and Tanzania was closed. And tourists weren't traveling across, researchers weren't going into Tanzania. And she asked me, the collections I went to see in Kenya were actually Tanzanian from Olduvai Gorge. And she said, why did you come here? People like you ask to look at Olduvai collections. We say, okay. They go to Kenya to look at them. And that's the last we ever hear of people like you. And I started thinking, well, would you be interested if somebody wanted to come here? The Olduvai collections are now back at the National Museum in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. They all are. And, but what happened is the year I got my PhD, my MA advisor phoned me up and said, how would you like a job for 8 months? And I came back to the University of Alberta to replace him as a professor for 1 year. And that was fall of 1985, and I'm still here. And why I'm still here is because SSHRC, which is the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which is a place we apply to for research funds. In the second, they kept me for 2 years here. In the second year, SSHRC created a postdoc for up to 5 years for what I jokingly call indigent PhDs in social sciences and humanities. And you had to be sponsored by a university. But if you got one of these fellowships, you would have a job for up to 5 years or until you became a regular tenure-track professor, whichever came first. So I found out about this from my former MA advisor. By the time I found out I could apply, I had a day and a half to do it. And I said, gee, when I was in Tanzania, people weren't really working there, and yet it's a major center for early human archaeology. So I'd like to go back to Tanzania and do Stone Age archaeology. So 4 months later, when I found out I got one of these, I had to write the museum director, who was the only person I knew, and said, I just got a job for 5 years in research money to do Stone Age archaeology in Tanzania. Any idea what I could do? And I went over in the next summer and talked to them and traveled. It's interesting because there were political issues about who could work where. I wasn't working in the famous parts of the country at all, and that was an intentional decision on my part. But the area that the museum director had suggested, the director of antiquities, the person that gives permits, said people already did that. Yeah. Go somewhere else. So we started in a new region, but eventually we realized that the region that the museum director had suggested to work on the oldest archaeology possibly had a lot of potential for the next stage in human evolution, the one that started a couple 100,000 years ago, give or take, which was becoming the most important African human origins research question. And it had the kind of places that should have the kind of sites that would answer really fundamental questions. that we weren't even talking about when I was a graduate student. And so we managed to get a letter. The last time I was in my original study area, we got a letter saying it was okay to talk to people in Iringa. And they took me around and showed me places, and every place was a site. And they were rock shelters and caves. Every single one of them had hundreds of artifacts and bones and things on the surface.
Wow.
And I didn't have a permit, but I had permission to ask people. So I took pictures and I wrote down where they were and said, we'll be back next summer. And a Canadian PhD student of mine and a Tanzanian PhD student of mine, my first, and I spent 30 days there the next summer. We test excavated, put meter square test pits in at 2 rock shelters, and we dug up 200 kilos worth of stuff. Wow. And we had fossil human remains as well. So all of a sudden we had fossil human sites as well in an area that no one had ever investigated before. So we've been working in Iringa ever since.
Is there still low-hanging fruit or stuff to be discovered in the field of archaeology in general, or even in Tanzania?
There's lots of things to be discovered. There are places that have never been investigated before. And partly because people want to go back to the famous regions. East Africa is really important because of the Rift Valley. The Rift Valley formed starting about 14, 15 million years ago, and it due to earthquake activity, and it lifts and drops layers of rock that have fossils and artifacts in them. Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania is different because it's like the Grand Canyon. You can basically see a series of layers, the bottom of which is about 2 million years old, and things eroding out all the way through it. But in the Rift Valley, things get buried relatively quickly and well preserved, and then they're exposed. So if you walk around, you can find things. And so that's why people keep going back to the same places. Iringa, where we've worked the last 15 years or so, was known for a site that wasn't as old as all of that, but was in an area that had just naturally eroded out. And the bottom of it's covered with thousands of artifacts. But it was when I realized that the period after that time period was really important, because what happened in the late 80s and early 90s was the creation of genetic models, initially from looking at modern human genetic diversity, and eventually from ancient DNA, especially from European sites. But now they've managed in African sites as well, that said that all of us had a common ancestor that was African, possibly as recently as 50,000 years ago.
Wow.
There are earlier humans in Africa that spread out into Asia and Europe, but the argument is that we're related to the ones that were still African up to about 50,000 years ago. And then when some of them left Africa, they interbred with the indigenous humans in Europe and Asia, and we know that from DNA studies, and replaced them.
Wow.
So, and in Europe, the arrival of modern humans is associated with the third stage of the Paleolithic, which is the Old Stone Age, what's referred to as the Upper Paleolithic. And you get art and jewelry and bone tools and a huge change in material culture. And it was always talked about as the human revolution, or the beginnings of being modern. But we know now that modern humans, ones that are anatomically modern like us today, are running around Africa at least 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. But you sure can't tell it from their archaeology.
I always ask archaeologists about the Stone Age, why don't we just watch the videos from those times?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in Europe, modern humans replaced Neanderthals. But at the same time that Neanderthals existed, there were modern humans in Africa, modern skeletally. But they have very similar archaeology to that of Neanderthals. So the question is, where does all that new stuff come from?
Right.
And there are occasionally African sites that have signs of new innovative technologies, but they don't last very long. And to get back to your original question about is there new stuff to find, Iringa shows absolutely that you just have to go and look. And I have a former PhD student, Canadian, Jennifer Miller, who's doing a postdoc in Jena, Germany. And until COVID hit, she was digging at a coastal cave site in Kenya. Nobody worked on coastal sites to look at the Stone Age in East Africa.
Why?
You work in the Rift Valley. But people interested in the last couple thousand years of East African history, as archaeologists were digging at this cave. And they found what they were looking for, but they kept on going. And the team that my former student Jennifer is involved with, they haven't hit bottom yet. And they've gone back to at least 80,000 years ago, continuously.
That's so cool.
So clearly, we should be looking at other places too. It's paint by numbers archaeology. Look for caves or rock shelters, places where there's hills, where there's natural overhangs. And in where we've worked, if you see one, just about every single one of them turns out to have been occupied in the past. Wow. Plus, since they're sheltered, you get organic material preserved. And it's fossilized, but it's preserved.
So do you run back to the lab and you carbon date these kind of skeletal remains, and that'll tell you how old they are? Or
we've tried with the skeletal remains. The problem in the tropics, radiocarbon, one, only works back to about 50,000 years ago.
Really?
And it's on organic material. So we can do it on charcoal. But the problem with bone, it's not the bone, it's the collagen, which is the organic fraction in bone that you would date with radiocarbon. And we have sent human skeletal remain fragments for radiocarbon dating for material we know has to be within the radiocarbon range. And the answer has always been, sorry, no collagen, no date. So we try using charcoal. Plus, there's a bunch of newer dating techniques on related material, on sediments, on trying to think what else. There's a variety of methods that allow us to go back further in the past.
Yeah.
And so we've applied some of those.
So that's one of my questions too, is how has what we know about that time changed since you started your career, and does it have to do with the technology and equipment?
Yeah. What happened, what's changed the most since I was a student was the recognition that Africa is the source of Homo sapiens like us, and that they didn't exist just 30 or 40,000 years ago. They existed 200, 300,000 years ago in Africa and at two sites in Israel when there's a short warm blip. The recognition that that's the case initially came from DNA studies of living humans worldwide and eventually from ancient DNA. And it's ironic that we have excavated a human burial from somewhere between 18 and 22,000 years ago. We couldn't get a radiocarbon date off of bone because no collagen, but the individual has ostrich eggshell beads on her wrist, jewelry. And ostrich eggshell radiocarbon dates beautifully.
Really?
So we know that our individual is probably between 18 and 22,000 years old. And remarkably, one of my former students is working with an ancient DNA team. They managed to get a DNA sample out of this individual, which was a real surprise. And a year ago, a paper was published in Nature, which is the top science journal around. I'm one of 44 co-authors. And the authors are people that either excavated human remains in East Africa in this time range or more recent, or the people that did DNA studies. And it was in a news story on the internet that I discovered that our individual is the oldest sub-Saharan African from which a DNA sample has been obtained so far.
Really?
And no one told me that. I had no idea. It's in the fine print in the appendix to this formal article. But somebody picked it up and wrote a news story about it. And I thought, oh my God, is that true?
Right.
So the other thing that's changed the most around the same time was the development of a bunch of new dating techniques that allow you to go older than the radiocarbon limit about 50,000 years ago.
Okay.
And you can do it on different kind of materials. You can do it on sediments. In the Middle East, they're doing it on burned flint stone tools. And flint is a very common material for making stone tools. And you're dating when they accidentally got dropped into a fireplace and burned. And that zeroes the signal that this method dates. And then it starts accumulating over time. So there's all sorts of new methods. So the genetic evidence points that Africa is the center not only for the earliest human beginnings, but the beginnings of our own species. And that's radically different from what I learned.
Wow.
And it just happened that we were in an area that likely had sites that could include that time period. And that's what we were funded to find, and we did. We have the period that the first modern humans date to, we have 5 fossilized human teeth from another site. And they were studied by a team at the British Natural History Museum. And they're at least 50,000 years old. They could be way older, but we can't prove it. And they represent an early Homo sapiens.
Wow. What does it indicate that they would be eating with those kind of teeth?
Probably similar things to some of the others. They're actively hunting. There's no question about that. They have spear points. They may have bow and arrows back 100,000+ years ago. There's lots of chopped up animal bones in these cave sites, and they represent a whole range of animals of different sizes. So they're bringing back hunks of meat and bone.
So, and you know a bit about the tools that they use. How sophisticated were some of these tools?
Some of them, like a lot of us, as part of our training to learn how to study them, tried to learn how to manufacture them ourselves and kind of nickname it as flint knapping. And some of them take a lot more skill than you would have thought they do. The oldest ones, you just have to be able to break a flake or a piece off of a larger pebble. And you've made it. You've got sharp edges. But by 1.8 million years ago, you have what's referred to as the Acheulean, where they're producing beautiful, large teardrop-shaped pieces that are shaped both on the front and the back. And that takes a lot of skill to do. And that's the kind of technology that some of the earliest humans took with them when they left Africa. Acheulean is named for Saint-Acheulean, which is the type site. It's up in northwestern France. So there are lots of Acheulean sites in Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, Africa. And these diagnostic tools stay very similar until about 500,000 years ago, they start concentrating more on shaping larger rocks to knock off pieces to shape into particular determined shapes. Sometimes you can shape a rock and knock off a piece finished to ready to go. It's called the Lavalla technique. Or you knock pieces off of a larger hunk of rock and then trim the edges into finished tools. And if you have those plus Acheulean hand axes, the teardrop shaped pieces, you're probably between about 500 and 200,000 years ago. If you have the smaller tools, but without the bigger ones, you're talking about what's referred to as the middle Paleolithic, starting around 200,000 or 300,000. And that's the archaeology of Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans in Africa.
Okay. And what about...
And what you see with modern humans by the time they hit Europe are very different kind of stone tools that are now made on parallel-sided hunks of rock and produce what are called blades. And these blades are trimmed at one end or a side. And there's a lot of organic bone, ivory, wood kind of tools. And they need specialized tools for making those.
Tools to make tools.
Yeah.
So has there ever been any supposed tools that we found and discovered, but we don't understand what they were for?
I'm sure there's lots of things. It's just a matter of trying to figure it out. You can see trace marks and wear on the edges of some stone tools that tell you what kind of material that they were used on. Some of them Some of them, especially projectile points, like spear points, in certain sites have kind of a glue or mastic still on them that shows that they were put into a handle and kind of glued in. So you can see something more about manufacturing methods. But we've been trying to do experiments, making and using things to see what's appropriate.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can have very basic things do a whole range of activities.
So you've been around quite a bit. What are some of the most exciting places that you've been, and what was the most? Because these can be political when you go and you dig up artifacts from somewhere else.
Yeah.
You have a process you have to go through. What was most kind of exciting or dangerous or maybe highly bureaucratic places that you had to go?
Well, every country has their own permit process. So if you want to direct an excavation, there's certain kind of regulations and rules. As a student, as I said, I went to volunteer on a site in southern France that had students from all over the world because that's such a famous region for Stone Age studies. And we volunteered for a professor from the University of Bordeaux. So he trained us and we were his field team. And we got to see lots. So we didn't need permits. We just needed him to say it was okay to come. But probably when I get a permit in Tanzania, I get 2 permits. One for COSTECH, which is their Committee on Science and Technology, which is for any kind of scientific research. And the second from the Division of Antiquities, which is the government agency that looks after like paleontology, archaeology, heritage. And at least one of their officers is with us the whole time we're in the field as an advisor and helper. But when in 2006, when we did our first excavations in Iringa, we hit the bottom end of this human burial. And we had local men digging for us. And we explained it wasn't one of their relatives. The paramount chief of this area in the late 19th century is buried below this cave site, Chief Makwawa. And he said, it's not Makwawa. It's not anybody from his time period. It's much older. And do they have any problem with this? And they liked the money I was paying them more than any issues about should we be doing this or not. But we did stop and go to talk to local officials about it. My antiquities officer phoned his headquarters that night and asked them if they had any issues. And they said, well, my permit checked off the box that we could excavate human remains, among other things, if we found them. And as far as they were concerned, it was perfectly okay, and congratulations.
Oh, okay.
And this is the burial that we went back 2 years later with a graduate student who was specializing in human skeletal studies. And it became the source of her honors BA, her master's thesis. And she's now the one that's working with the ancient DNA people. So, and it's the one that yielded this DNA sample.
Very cool.
The other one, the site where we found the modern human teeth that are way older, was really important because now we had fossil human remains for the first time. And no one had ever found anything like that outside of the Rift Valley and Olduvai in Tanzania.
So when you say fossilized, is it's preserved to some extent?
Like completely preserved, but turned to stone.
Oh, wow.
But because of changes in chemical composition in the burial environment and water dripping in. In these sites, the older it gets, the more likely there's kind of almost like a cement on top of material. But all the bone, animal bone or whatever that we've dug up from these older sites is completely turned to stone. It's fossilized.
That's wild.
And that's a function of the burial environment plus age.
Yeah.
But the teeth, I teach human paleontology, like fossil human evolution, even though I tell them I'm a stone tool person the first day, because it's all related. But we sent pictures to a man named Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London, who is the expert on the African origins of modern humans. He was the paleontologist that argued that model for years before it was confirmed. And I asked him for advice. And he immediately said, oh, we'll clean them. Our conservators will clean them. We'll study them. Fine. That great. Because we knew what they were. but we wanted specialists that could find out so many more things. They found out that they're sort of like Neanderthals. They're all from the upper jaw, probably from one person. They have scratch marks on the outside where it looks like they might have been holding a hide in their mouth and then a stone tool in the other hand, scraping the hide and nicking their front teeth. And you can see that with a scanning electron microscope. Neanderthals did that too. And there's a couple of teeth from about, trying to think how long ago, from the Acheulean, at least in southern England, Boxgrove, that have the same thing.
Amazing.
So, but they're all probably from the same person. Two of them were actually cemented together. And when they were clean, there was a little bit of the upper jaw still there. So they clearly belong. They're from next door to each other. But there were no duplicates. So they're just loose. So chances are they all belong to one person.
Okay. Wow.
So
that's incredible.
But the people that in London who studied them found out all sorts of stuff that we would never have been able to guess at. And that's how a project that starts out being one thing expands out, and you get a team of people together to do specialists in different areas to help out.
Are archaeologists a contemptible bunch, or are they easy to work with?
Most of us are pretty easy to work with.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting because there's lots of popular books about the people that do East African human origins, like fossils. And if you read those, all you think they're doing is competing with each other and screwing each other over, and they're fun to read. How true they are, who knows? Right. The reason why I worked in southern Tanzania rather than in the north was because a famous American team this is the late 80s, were working at Olduvai. They were working in Ethiopia and had discovered the oldest fossil humans known at that time. But the Ethiopians got ticked off because there were various foreign researchers all competing for access to the same place. And they couldn't get along with each other.
Yeah.
So the Ethiopian authorities shut everybody down for more than a decade while they straightened out who is going to be able to do what. So they moved off to different places. So some of them got permission to work at Olduvai in like 87, 88, 89 in there. And that was enough for me to say, okay, I'm not going to work anywhere near there.
Yeah.
They probably couldn't care less about archaeologists.
Sure. Yeah.
But we do.
Sure.
If we were trying to find fossil humans, we would work in the Rift Valley. And when we realized, we actually got geological maps for Iringa. And the bedrock geology is hundreds of millions of years old. And then it's got recent stuff on the top. So I joke that my fantasy about tripping over an early human skull will never happen. It's just not the right place geologically. But having the rock shelters means you have instant housing and you find things in there.
Yeah. You might run into a fresh skeleton.
Yeah. So the human remains we found are way more recent.
Yeah.
But they're still of interest to people.
Yeah.
So, and it's great. You get the textbooks now and they have a map of Africa and they putting points where all these things have been found. And all of a sudden, Iringa's got a point on the map.
That's because
and it's
of you.
It's listed in the Lista, or it's listed in a table in a review article saying what's coming out of different places.
Cool.
So we've actually worked in Iringa accidentally on just about every time period, including the time period of the chief from the 19th century, Makwawa.
Oh, wow. We
actually excavated the last day of our first field season. This is right below, in the rock shelter above where he's buried. We excavated a German East African rifle bullet that was made in 1877. It's got the date of manufacture on it.
Wow.
And Tanganyika was a German colony back then. Makwawa resisted German colonization. He ambushed a German patrol and killed all the soldiers. And they brought in a cannon and leveled his capital city. And he ran off into the bush and hid out at this cave for about 4 years until they caught up with him, and he's supposed to have killed himself rather than surrendered. But we have a German East African bullet casing from exactly the right time period. Frank, my one Tanzanian former student, he's actually been excavating at that famous battle site for Mkwawa. They brought in metal detectors, and they have dozens of rifle casings.
Wow.
And they have, I love historic archaeology, they have dates of manufacture on them. So, and we found out what the numbers and symbols meant because one of my grad students posted a picture of them on some guns and ammunition lovers listserv or discussion group.
My favorite people.
And within minutes, people emailed and told her.
Cool.
And there's actually a catalog of them. So we've used that.
It's a little bit like if you could pick up a fossil from, 25,000 years ago and it has a little label on it. It says, 25,000 years ago. Easy. Yeah, that's why I joke I fell in love with historic archaeology. We also found out that after we did our first field season, that a Tanzanian archaeologist had dug a test pit at the same place about 10 years before. And ours wasn't where his was. But when we went back in 2010 to excavate the burial and to expand our excavations, we found where they had dug because we got down to where they quit. And they'd obviously had their lunch before they buried it back up because we had peanut shells and masticated sugar cane and corn cobs and plastic water bottles with the date of manufacture that put it right in the time range. Wow. So they had their snacks or lunch, threw all their garbage in and buried it back up. So we know exactly where they had dug. Peanuts and sugar, the breakfast of champions. Yeah. So wow. Peanut shells, corn, sugar cane. Yeah. So crazy stuff. That's insane. So one more question before we go. What's on your agenda next? What is your plans? What do you want to discover first? What would you uncover if you had the unlimited funding? Yeah. For me, I'm getting old enough that I'm thinking I'm wrapping up things. But my former students will keep on working. I'd like them to investigate more of these sites because clearly they're important. My current PhD student, Philbert Cato from Tanzania, is actually working on the last few thousand years and working on pottery and pottery designs and the people that produce the pottery. And we have some pieces of pottery that represent a time period of the first pastoralists, people with domestic animals like sheep and goats and cattle. And southern Tanzania shouldn't have that stage at all. Northern Tanzania does. And then about 3,000 years ago, you see what's in sub-Saharan Africa we call the Iron Age, which is the appearance of iron tool making and using people who are farmers. And they represent the members of the Bantu language family. And we can see them show up. So we should go right from a Stone Age period right into the Iron Age. But we have potsherds, pieces of pottery that could belong to this so-called pastoral Neolithic. And I told Philbert he has to write a whole chapter in his dissertation about this and convince me. But if we can prove it, it will be the furthest south that we'd have any evidence of the pastoral Neolithic. It could be people, or it could just be trade or exchange. Some pots with something in it got traded in, but it's nowhere near where they should be. So that's kind of cool. This is the benefits of taking the path less beaten, right? That's your motto. Yeah, and we're saying there's something for everybody. No matter what you want to study, we have signs of it. Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, it was great to have you. We're going to have you back because you are just full of interesting knowledge. And so thank you for doing this. Pamela R Willoughby, professor of anthropology down there at the University of Alberta, Canada, PhD. Is there anything you want to add before we take off? Just that it's minus 27 Celsius today. Oh, God. And it's supposed to be back to almost freezing in 2 or 3 days. So we're staying inside as long as it takes to warm up. Hopefully with climate change, we'll see extremes in reverse tomorrow. It'll be 20 plus Celsius. So we'll see. Who knows? We'll see. All right. Well, we'll sign off now, but we'll talk afterwards. So we'll say goodbye to everybody out there. Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll see you next time.